Hello, everybody. In Chapter 12, we're going to be dealing with employee management issues. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about employee management issues, labor unions yesterday and today, tactics used in labor management conflicts, and then controversial employee management issues. So for management's responsibility is to produce a profit sometimes means making hard decisions, which aren't always popular with the employees. And then employee management issues require open discussion, goodwill, and compromise. So that kind of leads into unions. And we've all probably heard about unions. Probably the main unions you've heard about is maybe something like the teachers union, or in sports, something along the lines of like the players unions, whether it be the NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, something along those lines. So a union is an employee organization that has the main goal of representing members in employee management and bargaining over job-related issues. So labor unions were responsible for minimum wage laws, overtime rules, workers' compensation, severance pay, child labor laws, and then job safety regulations. So unions have had a really big impact on this country, and just kind of eliminating some of these things, such as like child labor laws, like you don't want kids working, from a very early age. Just workers' compensation overall. So we'll kind of go over some of the things that unions have done for this country. So to start out with, we have public sector labor unions, which public sector union membership for government, such as teachers, firefighters, police officers, so on and so forth. And then union membership for the public sector stands at 34% compared to 6.7% of the private sector. So a little bit of history for organized labor. So we do have craft unions, which is an organization of skilled specialists in a particular craft or trade. First thing that kind of comes to mind is something like the carpenters union, plumbers, electricians, different thing like that. Anything to kind of do with the trade. This has been around as early as 1792 with shoemakers being in Philadelphia. Craft union met to discuss fundamental work issues. Work weeks were 60 plus hours, wages were low, and child labor was rampant. So we did have the Knights of Labor, which was the first national labor union formed in 1869. The Knights offered membership to all private working people, but fell from prominence after the riot in Chicago. And then we do have the AFL, or American Federation of Labor, which is an organization of craft unions that championed fundamental labor issues, and this was founded in 1886. Industrial unions, labor organizations of unskilled or semi-skilled workers in mass production industries such as automobiles and mining. And then we have Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, which is a union organization of unskilled workers. This broke away from the AFL in 1935 and rejoined in 1955. The AFL and CIO today has affiliations with 55 unions and has about 12.5 union members. So while technological achievements of the Industrial Revolution reduced the need for physical labor in many industries, it also put pressure on workers to achieve higher productivity in factory jobs that called for long hours and low pay. Can you see how these conditions made it possible for labor unions to take hold by the turn of the 20th century? So early on in the United States, especially, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when we were going through the Industrial Revolution, we did have such a big problem with things like child labor laws, or just children working, and then later on child labor laws came into effect, but, kids were working 20 hours a day, and then, not just kid, but also everybody else was working really long hours. They were completely overworked. They were working 7 days a week. They weren't paid for overtime just because things like that weren't around. One of the classic examples of being overworked and the need for unions came with the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. So it's about a meat industry in Chicago. There's one point in the book that it talks about seeing an individual that was being overworked in this meatpacking factory, and the individual fell into a vat of sausage, and the individual was just never found. And this kind of got things going from a government standpoint to kind of take a look at some of these things that were happening in the factories. Labor started to come together, and get these unions all put together and kind of helped curb some of these incidents that were happening and get some of the laws put in place that we have here today. So labor legislation and collective bargaining. Labor unions' growth and influence is very dependent on public opinion and law. So we have the Norris LaGuardia Act, which helped unions by prohibiting the use of yellow dog contracts. So these contracts were a type of contract that required employees to agree as a condition of employment not to join a union. And then collective bargaining, which is the process whereby union and management representatives form a labor management agreement or contract for workers. So this is going to be, if it is a teachers union, it's going to be between the teachers and then the management to kind of figure out, the terms of the contract and, how long the contract is going to be for. So the next couple of slides, we're going to go over a couple of notable acts here in the United States. So we just talked about this in the Norris-LaGuardia Act. So this prohibited courts from issuing injunctions against nonviolent union activities, and it outlawed those yellow dog contracts. For the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act of 1935, this gave employees the right to join or form a union, and then or refuse or to join the union for that matter, and then the right to collectively bargain with employers through elected union representatives. So this was a really big, act that went into put into place, just because, before this act, if a group of employees were talking about forming a union or joining a union, one or two things would kind of happen where, management would get a bunch of guys together, pay them a little bit extra and say, all right, you need to threaten these individuals that are wanting to join a union or start a union, or we're just going to flat out fire them. And then that started to create a lot of riots that were happening at a lot of these factories and everything. So, I mean, if you go back and there's a bunch of movies about, different labor relations and everything. One of the movies that comes to mind for me is On the Waterfront, which has Marlon Brando in it. A lot of really good scenes about being part of a union in there with dock workers and everything. So that can kind of give you a little bit of an idea as to some of the rough times that these labor unions had. And then obviously, if you want to go back to the 1920s, even before that, when you have mobsters being involved with the unions and everything. I mean, there's tons of stories dealing with the mob, how they dealt with the unions, were able to actually kind of help the unions, and then just kind of go back and forth with the employers on it. So we have Fair Labor Standards. This was the act of 1938. So this set a minimum wage and maximum basic hours for workers in interstate commerce industries. So the first minimum wage was set at 25 cents an hour, except for farm and retail workers. So we saw the benefits of that here today. So the maximum somebody can work for a week is 40 hours, and then beyond that, you do have to pay them extra for working that long. So if you're making $10 an hour, you work for 40 hours. After that 40 hours, you get time and a half, which if you're making $10 an hour, that'd be $15 an hour. So if you're working 43 hours a week, those 3 hours are going to be at $15 an hour. This next one, Taft-Hartley Act, 1947. This amended the Wagner Act and permitted states to pass laws prohibiting compulsory union membership or right-to-work laws. This set up methods to deal with strikes that affect national health and safety, prohibited secondary boycotts, closed shop agreements, and feather bedding. A lot of these terms we'll go over here later on in the slides. And then Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, or the Lanham-Griffin Act, 1959. This has amended the Hartley-Taft Act and the Wagner Act, so it guaranteed individual rights of union members in dealing with their unions, such as the right to nominate candidates for union office, vote in union elections, attend and participate in union meetings, vote on union business, and examine union records. So one of the goals of this act was to clean up union corruption. Like I was, talking about a couple of minutes ago, the mob had a very big role in unions, and this act, helped kind of curb some of that corruption. Now, I grew up in a home where my dad was part of a union. So I've seen, the good things about the union. I've also seen the bad side of the union as well. So, I'm not going to say I'm for or against unions. I do think they do have their purpose and they serve their purpose in the United States. I definitely think they still can serve a purpose here. It's just all about, kind of a give and take with it. So I do want to touch on one more thing here, and this isn't going to be listed here in the next couple of slides, but we did have a pretty big, groundbreaking decision come out of the Supreme Court. I think it was last summer with Janus versus the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Council. So essentially, what that decision did from the Supreme Court was saying that if you were part of a public union, such as like state workers, then you do not have to be charged for union fees. So this ended up, originating here in Springfield, Illinois, where this one individual, he was tired of getting charged for union fees, even though he wasn't part of a public union with the state of Illinois. So went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that he does not have to pay fees, and anybody who's part of a public union does not have to pay those fees if they are not part of the union. So that was a groundbreaking decision. Now that does not cover the private sector, but if you are in a public, setting, you don't have to pay those fees. So, for example, if you're part of a public union like a teachers union, you don't have to pay towards the teachers union unless you are part of that union. So, union organizing campaigns. So, the National Labor Relations Board was created to oversee labor management issues and provide guidelines for unionization. So, you do have to get certification for that, which is just the formal process by where a union is recognized. And then you can also get decertification for that, which is the process in which workers take away unions' rights to represent them. So why would you join a union? Pro-union attitudes, like I said, they do a lot of good for the workers. Poor management, employee relations. That's another reason to bring in a union, just to kind of have that third party to do a little bit of negotiation. Possible negative organizational climate. If you have poor working conditions, we've talked about Amazon. Some of their working conditions currently aren't the best. Unions' reputation. I mean, they do have a lot of money behind them. They have a lot of people behind them, and that way they can kind of step in and help you out. And then overall job security. If you are part of a union, you're going to have pretty good job security. So one of the unions that comes to mind for me is like a carpenters union. If you are currently working with the union and you get laid off, you can go to the union hall and they will help you find a job as quickly as possible. And then you get called up, you go to work for another carpenter, and then that way you're not out of work all that long. So some of the objectives of organized labor over time. So the negotiated labor management agreement or the labor contract. This is an agreement that sets the tone and clarifies the terms under which management and labor agree to function over a period of time. And then we do have a union security clause, which is a provision in negotiated labor management agreement that stipulates that employees who benefit from a union must either officially join or at least pay dues to the union. So this kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the Janus decision. So on a private sector, I mean, if you are going to have an individual that's going to benefit from the unions, then they must continue to pay into it. So a couple different types of security agreements. So we have a closed shop agreement, which specified workers had to be members of a union before being hired. This was outlawed in 1947. There's a union shop agreement saying workers do not have to be members of a union to be hired, but they must agree to join the union within a prescribed period. I think Kroger is one of the organizations that still follows by a union shop agreement. I don't think we have a Kroger here anymore in Springfield, but they are here throughout the Midwest and throughout the United States for that matter. And then you have an agency shop agreement. Says employers may hire non-union workers. Employees are not required to join a union, but must pay a union fee. So this just kind of goes through the different forms of union agreements. We just talked about closed shop, union shop, agency shop. We do have an open shop, which union membership is voluntary for new and existing employees. Those who not join the union don't have to pay union dues. A few union contracts are of this type. I would say that would probably be the best one. Then that way, you're not pressuring anybody to join the union. Nobody's out of fees, and we'll probably actually start to see more open shops just because with the Janus decision coming down. We do have right to work laws, so this is legislation that gives workers the right to under an open shop or join or not to join a union if it's present. So the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 granted states the power to outlaw union shop agreements. And then we do have open shop agreements, which is the agreement in a right to work state that gives workers the option to join or not join a union if one exists in their workplace. So we do hear a lot about this in politics here today about right to work states. I'm going to say Wisconsin. They just voted to go over to being a right to work state. So I know that's been a hot topic between Illinois just because Wisconsin is one of our border states, and seeing if Illinois wants to be a right to work state. I know typically, Republicans, they are typically anti-union, whereas Democrats are a little more pro-union. So here between, we had Governor Rauner, he was anti-union. Now we have Pritzker, who's a little more pro-union. So states with right to work laws. So here in Illinois, we are not a right to work state, and then Wisconsin, they are a right to work state. So I mean, if you look around the landscape, there are quite a few right to work states that are currently out there. Like I was talking about, if you say between Democrats and Republicans, typically, Illinois is a very Democratic state. Same with California. You go up here to the Northeast, you do have New York, and a lot of these states up here, they're not right to work states just because typically these are a little more Democratic states. Some of these more southern states such as Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, they have a very heavy Republican presence, so it's not uncommon for them to see that they are right to work states. So resolving labor management disagreements. Labor contracts outline labor and management's rights and service as a guide to workplace relations. So if there are grievances, these are charged by employees that management is not abiding by the terms of a negotiated agreement. If you're working I'll use my wife as example because she's part of a teachers union. So, if she does have an issue at her job, she can file a grievance. Go talk to her union rep. The union rep talks to their overall union. The union will come back to the school and say, okay, here's the issue that we're having at the school. What are you going to do to, correct it? And then it goes from there. So, I mean, if you are part of a union, definitely use that union rep and, the representation just because they're able to get a lot more things done than rather just one person going to talk to management. So you do have shop stewards, which are union officials who work permanently in an organization and represent employee interest on a daily basis. This would kind of be like your union representative. Bargaining zone. This is going to be the range of options between the initial and final offer that each party will consider before negotiations dissolve and reach an impasse. We have mediation and arbitration. So mediation is just the use of a third party mediator who encourages both sides in a dispute to continue negotiation and often makes suggestions for resolving the dispute. And then arbitration, which is the agreement to bring in an impartial third party, a single arbitrator or a panel of arbitrators to render a binding decision in a labor dispute. So if you do bring in a mediator will suggest a lot of things, but you don't have to go with their decision. If you do go with an arbitrator, you have to go with an arbitrator's decision. So that is the difference between the two of them there. So some of the tactics that labor unions use: strikes, boycotts, work slowdowns, and pickets, and we'll kind of go over all four of those here in the next couple of slides. So a strike, probably most of you have heard about that. So that's just a strategy in which workers refuse to go to work. The purpose is to further workers' objectives after an impasse is in collective bargaining. So with a strike, I mean, nobody's going to be at work. Nothing's going to be getting done. Then that's going to come back on management and say, if they are producing the products, we can't get this product out because we don't have any workers here that are able to do it. So that can kind of, put some pressure on management to hopefully get an agreement with the union put together. We have a primary boycott, which when a union encourages both its members and the general public not to buy products or a firm involved in a labor dispute. And then a secondary boycott, which is an attempt by labor to convince others to stop doing business with a firm that is subject of a primary boycott. This is prohibited by a Taft-Hartley Act. So to go back to kind of the primary boycott, if you are part of like a union where that is going on strike against, Chevrolet or GM, the union might come out and say, we need to boycott all GM products at this point, and then they'll get a campaign put together and get that out to the general public and say, you need to not buy from General Motors during this period of time because here's what they're doing to us and here's what they're doing to our workers. So some strikes. In 2016, members of the Communications Workers of America held a strike against Verizon Wireless in the effort to increase wages and add jobs. The strike succeeded after a 7-week walkout, leading to 1,400 new jobs and pay raises as high as 10%. What can other unions learn from this successful strike? They're talking about a walkout here. So essentially what that was is that was just an agreement between union employees who got together one day and said, we're going to walk out at this period of time throughout the day, and we're not going to come back until our demands are met. So that's exactly what they did. So, this can be a very powerful movement. We were just talking about that in the last slide about how, if you do go on strike, you can get a lot of things done just because it puts a lot of pressure on management to, hopefully get an agreement to whatever you're asking. So some of the tactics used by management include lockouts, injunctions, and then strike breakers. So a lockout, that's just an attempt by management to put pressure on unions by temporarily closing the business. So if a job is able to go with a lockout, it's exactly what it says. They will just lock their employees out and say, you're not allowed to work here until we figure this out. And then, that puts a lot of pressure on the employees just because they're not going to get paid for doing anything. It also puts pressure on management because they're not going to have a product or service to be put out there. But at the same time, if they can get by for a little bit until they can get those negotiations settled, that could be an effective tool. You have an injunction, which is a court order directing someone to do something or to refrain from doing something. And then we've got strike breakers, which are workers hired to do the jobs of striking workers until the labor dispute is resolved, called scabs by unions. Really good example of this is the movie called The Replacements, which is about like an NFL strike, and then they bring in other players to do the job for them. We just had that in the NFL not that long ago with the strike that was happening between the NFL and the referee union, and then we got those replacement referees. So I think that went on for about 4 or 5 weeks to start out the NFL season. And those referees were just god awful. That was such a hot topic every day on the news about how like the referees were just blowing call after call. The big one was the game between the Green Bay Packers and the Seattle Seahawks. You had the Hail Mary pass, and that ended up not working out for the Packers. If you're a Packer fan, I'm sorry for that. But that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back and got the negotiations going again between the union and the NFL to finally get those referees back to work. So another example here is the conflict between NBA players and owners in 2011 resulted in the owners locking the players out of team facilities for many months. How did the lockout affect the 2011 and 2012 season? What effects did the lockout have on fans? So what ended up happening is it was a shortened season. I want to say the season was about 50 games that year. And they were able to come into some sort of agreement after they had locked everybody out. They're actually going to go back and relook at some of those terms here in the next couple of years. Usually the labor agreements will only be for about 5 or 6 years at a time. So, the effect from a fan standpoint is we weren't able to watch as many games that year. It was actually kind of nice to have a 50-game season just because the NBA season, I think, is too long anyways. Some of you might disagree with that, but having a shorter season, it was kind of nice to where, you only have 50 games and then you're into the playoffs. So I think some of the players would probably agree with that as well. But, unfortunately, they were locked out from, going into the facilities, playing the game, so they weren't able to make as much money as they typically would. So some of the future of unions and labor management relations, that is to grow unions, will need to include more white-collar, female and foreign-born workers. Some of the unions will need to organize in industries such as healthcare and information technology. And then unions will take on a greater role of training workers, redesigning jobs, and assimilating the changing workforce. So we haven't seen too much of a rise in unions in recent years, just because some of the laws that we do have right now are so strong that help the employees within organizations. But at the same time, just like this says, if unions are going to continue to strive, they need to adapt and go over, to more white collar jobs. And they just kind of need to reorganize and figure out kind of what they need to do as far as attaining new memberships and starting new unions. So here's union membership by state. Uh, as you can see, New York, it has one of the highest ones here of 20% or more of the employees are part of a union. Illinois, still pretty high. We're at 15 to 19.9%. So some of these states, Utah, Texas, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina all have pretty low numbers as far as union membership goes. So executive compensation, the average CEO's compensation, salary, bonuses, and incentives is about 10.4 million compared to just over $38,000 for the average worker. The CEO compensation used to determine by a firm's profitability or increase in stock price, and now executives receive stock options and restricted stock that is awarded even if the company performs poorly. So this is, a huge sticking point whenever employees are kind of going to management saying, this individual is getting paid $10.4 million, we're getting paid $38,000. Like, how can we rectify this situation? So some people suggest that CEOs should not make more than 20 times the average salary of their company, but in reality, they make 344 times the average salary. Government and shareholders are putting pressure to overhaul executive compensation. The passage of Dodd-Frank Act was intended to give shareholders more say in compensation decisions, and then the SEC is considering rescinding the rule. So, as you look around, there are a few organizations out there that the CEOs are agreeing to take less money just because of public perception, and it just looks better, for the organization. And it also helps with morale with the employees, and they can say, my CEO, he took less money just to, hopefully give more money to me. So, like I said, that definitely helps out with morale. So pay equity. So women earn 79% of what men earn. This disparity varies by profession, experience, level of education. Young women actually earn 7% more than male counterparts due to higher college graduation rates. And when women are underrepresented in managerial positions. So this is something I think we're going to see definitely a change in the next 10 to 20 years. Just because it does say here young women are actually earn 7% more than male counterparts due to the higher college graduation rates. At this point, we're having men and women go through college and get the same education, and we're not seeing as much of a difference between women, whereas back in like the 50s and the 60s, women were typically kind of stay-at-home mom. That situation where from the 70s on, women were starting to get into the workforce a little bit more. They're starting to be seen a little bit more, and now hopefully some of that disparity can start to be a little less. So equal pay for equal work. We want to make sure that equal pay acts factors that justify pay differences include skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions. If you're doing the same of all of this, you deserve to get the same pay for it. So salary gender gap, kind of what we were talking about here. Between age 16 to 19, women earn 21,000 compared to men of about 22, almost 23,000. And then kind of as you go through it, the big one here is, especially the older you get. If you look, 35 to 44, 45, there's about a $10,000 pay gap those generations. Same way as you get up. Yeah, even I think the biggest one here is probably about 45 to 54. You're looking at about $12,000 in a pay gap for that one. So, that's a huge amount of money between the gender gaps. So one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is sexual harassment. These are just the unwelcome sexual advances, requests, or for sexual favors and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature that creates a hostile work environment. Sexual harassment laws cover men, women, and foreign companies doing business in the United States. Violations can be extremely expensive for businesses. So Any job that you have, you're probably going to have some sort of sexual harassment training or just a very broad harassment training that will cover sexual harassment at some point or another. It's definitely something that a lot of these companies are trying to get rid of. When I don't know if anybody's seen Mad Men before, but if you kind of go back, I mean, a lot of the things that they do in Mad Men wouldn't be acceptable at all by today's standards. So it's really kind of interesting to see kind of the difference between that 1960 type of lifestyle and what's happening today. So a couple of things that go along with sexual harassment is quid pro quo sexual harassment involves things like go out with me or you're fired. An employee's job is based on submission. You also have hostile work environment. Sexual harassment is conduct that interferes with a worker's performance or creates intimidating or offensive work environment. So, although most employees are aware of sexual harassment policies in the workplace, they're often not certain what sexual harassment actually means. Should companies train employees about the do's and don'ts of acceptable sexual conduct on the job? I mean, definitely think that they need to train and have some sort of training. If not yearly, I would say every couple of years, just as a constant reminder for it. I mean, just right here on the picture, this individual has his arm or his hand on the employee. That's kind of a big no these days where I typically, don't touch anybody that I work with. I mean, unless, we're shaking hands and that sort of thing, just because, I mean, it can be perceived as something else these days. So, like I said, it's a really good idea to go through that training to just kind of, refamiliarize yourself and think, you know, these are some things that, aren't acceptable in the workplace, and you constantly need to be reminded about that. So I'm going to go through a couple of situations here, and you can make the call on that. So two colleagues walk by you as one delivers the punch line to a very dirty joke. If you feel the joke is inappropriate, is this sexual harassment under the law? Um, I would say yes on that because it made you feel, like it was a little inappropriate. Anytime there are inappropriate kind of jokes like that, and you feel uncomfortable by it, you can always go to HR, let them know about it, and then they'll deal with it from there. And then the second one, an employee thinks that she may have been sexually harassed when her boss complimented her blouse. She explains the circumstances and asks, wouldn't you be upset? What is your response? So, without actually knowing what was said about it, I mean, that could be viewed, in different ways. So, if the boss was very specific about the blouse and maybe complimented it like, on her figure or something like that, then yes, that would probably be sexual harassment. If he just simply said something like, oh, I like your blouse, I really like that color or something, that probably wouldn't be considered sexual harassment in that situation. If you feel like something is borderline, you can always go to, HR, and they'll be able to help you walk yourself through it. So, childcare, we get 3/4 of women with children under 18 are in the workforce. So, childcare related absences cost businesses $1 billion each year. So, who should pay for the cost of childcare? This is a dividing issue among employees and businesses. So, we've talked about in recent chapters about having, childcare at work and about how that can be a huge recruiting tool for different employers. I've talked to, I'm expecting my first child, so, not exactly how sure or how much childcare is going to be and everything at this point. But, I do have a lot of friends that say, childcare can be anywhere between $500 to $1,000 per month per child. So, I mean, that is a huge expense whenever you do have, several children. So some of the benefits of this can include, discounts with childcare providers, vouchers that offer payment for childcare, referral services, identifying high quality childcare facilities, on-site childcare centers, kind of like we've talked about in previous chapters, and then sick child centers. So if you do have a sick child, you can take them in to someplace at your, work and get your child looked over. Elder care. So about 40 million family caregivers provide unpaid care to an elderly person. Caregiving obligations cause employees to miss about 15 million days of work per year. Costs could rise up to 33 billion annually, and many firms now offer employee assistance programs. So if you do have a grandparent or a parent that's getting a little bit older, can't be by themselves anymore, that can definitely kind of play into, missing work, especially if they have doctor's appointments and different things. I know my grandfather, he lived with us for about 10 years before he passed away, and that was a big thing. I mean, luckily, my mom had a lot of free time to where she could take him to doctor's appointments and different things like that. But I mean, it definitely was a strain on our family just because my mom was doing a lot of the appointments with him and everything, and my dad, he was busy working. My uncle and my aunt, they were busy working, and that was just kind of an agreement that we had within our family that my mom was kind of going to be the um, main caregiver for my grandfather. And it worked out well for us, but not every family kind of has that situation to where they might have somebody who's able to help out an elder person. So more and more boomers are taking care of their parents while still working. So 31% say they may delay their retirement. The average cost of at-home health care is about $3,800 a month. And then adult children currently contribute $7,000 to $14,000 a year for nursing home, health care, and home aids for parents. So, when my grandfather did get towards the end of his life, he was in assisted living, and the cost of that per month was about $3,000 per month, which is a really big number. So, I mean, he wasn't there for a full year, but I mean, a full year of that would be about $36,000, and I mean that's a pretty good chunk of change that is going towards that health care. So that's something that you have to consider if you do have like that grandparent or that parent that's getting a little bit older, and you might have to take care of them at some point, or at least contribute with the cost of it. So we got drug abuse and drug testing. I think I talked about this in the last chapter about how every job I've ever had, I've had to get drug testing at some point. So alcohol is the most widely used drug, with 8.7% of full-time employees considered heavy drinkers. Over 8% of workers used or aged 18 to 49 use illegal drugs and are more likely to be in workplace accidents. Drug abuse costs the economy 414 billion in lost work, healthcare costs, crime, traffic accidents, and other expenses. And then over 60% of major companies drug test new employees, kind of like what I was saying here. So right now we have a lot of states that are legalizing marijuana, so it's going to be interesting to see kind of how that plays out. I do have a buddy who works out in Colorado has legalized recreational marijuana, but he works for Caterpillar, and Caterpillar still says, even if you're living out there, you are not to be smoking marijuana, just because they have that policy put in place. You could get into a workplace accident and that sort of thing. So he says he doesn't get drug tested unless he does get into a workplace accident, but he doesn't even chance it, just because you never know when you're going to get in a workplace accident, and then he wouldn't be covered by insurance at that point. So some violence and bullying in the workplace. So OSHA reports homicides account for 8% of all workplace deaths. Homicide is the number one cause of death for women in the workplace. Companies have taken action to deal with potential problems by using focus groups and other interactions. In many states, employers can seek a temporary restraining order on behalf of workers. So according to the Workplace Bullying Institute, bullying at workplace involves repeated health-harming mistreatment. Bullying is 4 times more common than sexual harassment. Workplace bullying involves psychological and physical abuse and tends to target the strongest employees. So this is one of those things, like, even if you think bullying is only happening at school, that's not the case. I mean, organizations are just really big schools for the most part. So you do have those bullying situations to where you might have somebody who's constantly on another employee about something. So as you're going through work, I'm sure you'll probably see some sort of anti-bullying or anti-harassment videos, and it'll go into detail about that as well. So some of the warning signs of possible workplace violence, unprovoked outbursts, anger or rage, threats or verbal abuse, repeated suicidal comments, paranoid behavior, increased frequency or domestic problems. If you do run into situations like this, it's best to reach out to HR as quickly as possible. They have the means and the resources to deal with these types of situations, and then they can go in and do a full investigation to see exactly what's going on.